This was supposed to be the crowning achievement, celebrating over a decade of planning, development and content. But a buggy launch with a broken campaign, a lack of updates, and controversial DLCs have left a lot of us wondering what's going on at Creative Assembly and what the future holds for Total War Warhammer 3. Now, for anyone unfamiliar with the Total War games, they're basically a mix of turn-based grand strategy and real-time battles, taking place on a giant map. But what really defines the Warhammer games is the setting. With everything from monsters to magic and dinosaurs to demons, things get chaotic pretty quickly, and that's a lot of fun. But I'm getting ahead of myself. See, Warhammer 3 marks the end of a trilogy of games, and to understand just how big of a deal this game is, we need to go back to 2016, back when Creative Assembly's reputation was at an all-time low, after the disaster of Rome 2, and an honestly pretty good but totally ignored Attila game. With their backs to the wall, the studio pivoted to a new direction, exchanging the historical setting for the fantasy world of Warhammer. There was a lot of excitement at the time, but I don't think anyone really believed Creative Assembly could handle monsters and magic, given their recent struggles. But as it turned out, they handled it pretty well, and with the release of Total War Warhammer 2 a year later, things really stepped up, bringing fan-favourite factions like the Dark Elves, Lizardmen and Skaven to the game. Though it was really the DLC that took things to the next level. Now I know if you take a look at the Steam page for this game, your Paradox alarm might go off, but bear with me for a moment. See, the DLCs here are really well received, mostly optional, and generally really good value for money. I mean, there are definitely some duds here and there, like the Blood DLC, which I'm not even going to try and justify, just like the cut content faction pre-order that's in every game. But honestly, those are more like pre-order punishments than a bonus. See, in every game, there's always been a race that they cut out and put as a pre-order bonus, but it's almost always the worst faction in the game, and they almost always get neglected in updates. So at least if you don't own them, you might actually think they're decent when you go up against them in the campaign. I will also mention here that the faction DLC for Warhammer 1 was especially bad. They came with some boring mini campaigns that nobody played, and while those factions were eventually ported forward and updated to be pretty good, those campaigns never came with them, and honestly nobody cares. Now I can't talk about DLC without talking about the DLC that defined Warhammer 2. Mortal Empires, a free update for people who owned the previous game that merged both of them into a mega map of sorts, with every past, present and future faction having a place in the Thunderdome, and that played just as well as it sounded. Mind you, it wasn't all smooth sailing, despite what you might hear now. The launch was terrible and the turn times really dragged. I mean, people were running exercise programs between turns. I'm not even joking, I was right in there with them. That said, they did eventually fix that and a lot of other stuff over the past 5 years. Really, Mortal Empires outgrew Warhammer 2. It was where the bulk of the content and updates happened, and it was hard to justify playing a cut down experience in the Vortex mode over it. But by the end, it really did need a sequel to fix some core issues. Namely, diplomacy was completely worthless in the game. I mean, I get it's Warhammer and all, but vassals didn't work. Neither did allies, and there really wasn't much interaction between factions. The late game was also non-existent. You basically snowballed out of control on every difficulty, with the only real change being how long it took you, and this led to basically nobody finishing campaigns, since all the fun was front-loaded, and the Chaos Invasion hit like a wet sock, if it even hit at all. Half the time you'd never even see them in your campaign. So much for the end of the world crisis. I gotta mention sieges too. They were basically the same fight on the same maps again and again, with the same crappy garrisons and the same pretty easy to break AI. Really, so many of the systems in the game were just outdated by the end, and the community did a pretty good job of making sure that Creative Assembly were aware of most if not all of them, and to their credit they did seem like they were listening. We got news of a Siege rework pretty early on, alongside Chaos rework teasers and some other cool stuff as the hype train built up for Warhammer 3. So I guess it's finally time to talk about it. Well, almost. See, during Warhammer 2's lifespan, Creative Assembly released another mainline game called Three Kingdoms that was more of a classic Total War game. And that's a bit of an understatement. It was basically the best launch Total War game that there's ever been, and honestly, there were just so many cool features in that game that hyped me and I think a lot of the members of the community up for the next game. And I could make an entire video about just that game alone. But this video is about the Warhammer games, so why am I even mentioning it? Well, despite selling incredibly well and having a player count that almost rivaled Warhammer 2's, Creative Assembly announced that the game was basically being abandoned in favour of a reboot that would come sometime in the future. No official reason was given, but it was pretty clear online that nobody had bought the DLCs, and the game just wasn't making as much money as the Warhammer games were. The thing is, the DLC that they actually released was garbage. They ignored everything players asked for in favour of DLCs that nobody cared about, repeatedly, and then wondered why nobody bought it and it sold so poorly. Basically the total opposite of Warhammer 2's post-launch DLC. Now you may wonder what that has to do with Warhammer 3, but just know for now that the community goodwill that had been building up for years took a big hit before the release of Warhammer 3. But hey, if the game sold well it wouldn't matter, right? Total War Warhammer 3 released on the 17th of February 2022. Now that looks a little strange, but I quickly realised why once I got into it. See, performance issues aside, the game sort of pushes you to start with the prologue tutorial, and it's incredibly well done. Honestly, some of the very best content Creative Assembly has ever done. It's fun, interesting, and kind of made me realise how worthless their tutorials have been so far. I mean honestly, without Reddit and YouTube, I wouldn't be playing the series today. Now at this point, Warhammer 3 was exceeding my expectations, so I didn't understand what was going on with the player count. And then I started the Realms of Chaos. Oh boy. I could fill this entire video with every strange decision and broken feature in this mode, but I'd be here for days. The biggest issue really is that even today, in its patched state, it's still a major step down from where Warhammer 2 left off. And that's not even the worst thing. This mode was supposed to demo off the new headline features that were coming with the game, like the siege rework. Now I do like the bigger maps, but I didn't believe for a second that the AI would be able to handle them. And they can't. So you can imagine my surprise then when I realised that they also made these maps dynamic, with a new buildable system blocking off some areas and adding towers to others. Now I get in a perfect world, you would fall back to defensive positions and basically have these multi-layered sieges. But that was never going to happen with this AI. So why they made it even harder on them, I have no idea. And they did all of this without actually fixing any of the other issues with the old siege system. 5 years on, and we still can't put some ranged units and artillery on walls, magic still doesn't work on them, and unit pathfinding is still broken on them. That, plus the attackers still being able to pull out these dusty ladders from the warp, means the best way to play every siege is to have some useless units activate towers, and hole everybody else up in the centre while you wait for the new buildable spawns to kill them. Speaking of ladders, why are these still a thing? They completely broke siege equipment back then, and they still do now. Why would you waste multiple turns building towers where you can just rush your units to the walls? Especially with the wall combat issues, which I still feel like could have been fixed just by making them wider. I mean, you had the space. Now aside from sieges, there were a few new systems I'll talk about later, but there wasn't really much else new. Now don't get me wrong, the new factions were beautiful, but the systems around them hadn't changed that much. Agents were still the same, diplomacy still kind of sucked, and if not for the rifts you would still snowball out of control. Overall, it was a pretty terrible experience for returning players, and a kind of boring one for newer ones. I really did love that intro, and I wish they'd gone further with that, and made a more cinematic story style choice-based sandbox mode instead. It's not like anybody was even going to play Realms of Chaos much anyway once Immortal Empires came out. So why was it even there? Well, Creative Assembly needed to give something to all the players who wouldn't be playing the new mega map because they don't own all 3 games. Now back in 2016 that didn't seem like such a big deal, but it's been over half a decade of it dominating Warhammer 2. So why Creative Assembly still locked it behind a 3-game paywall? I don't know. They've already shown how to handle it. Factions you didn't buy in Mortal Empires still appeared on the map, you just couldn't play as them. So why not expand this to everyone? Instead, they opened with the Realms of Chaos mode that took months of patching to get fixed, only to be completely ignored when the new Mortal Empires mode launched. And what a launch it was. The first time I opened the Lord selection screen and saw the map, I just kinda sat there for a while like, yeah, this is awesome, but what do I pick? And how's this gonna run? Honestly, pretty well. The turn time fix that came in late in Warhammer 2's life cycle seemed like it made it across. That or the AI just never turned up. No joke, the release AI was genuinely non-existent. They just sat in the base and ran away from everything, maybe daring to do the occasional force march into sack into run away again of some unguarded settlement you had on the other side of the map. This basically made every fight in the game either a siege or a settlement battle, with all of the same issues as before, and it only got worse from there. See, there wasn't actually anything new added. Yes, the map's bigger and looks a lot nicer, and there's more factions, but it played exactly the same as it did before, with all of the same issues. Well, actually, it played worse. There was a lot of cut content like survival battles, unique faction sounds, artwork, intro movies and quest battles, among a lot of other stuff. And on launch day there were no mods to kind of bridge that gap, like the awesome legendary lore mod, or some of the reskin and content overhaul mods like the Simply Fun mod. For me the biggest missing mod was the Recruit Defeated Lords mod. This mod added so much for my Warhammer 2 experience that I forgot it wasn't part of the base game. All of this was on top of the expected bugs and balance issues, and that made for a rough experience once the initial hype and fun died down, and Creative Assembly really didn't do themselves any favours with the few changes we did get. Earlier in the video I said that nobody finished campaigns in Warhammer 2 because the snowball was out of control, so to fix this they made the endgame come sooner with the economy changes and then added this. I mean, what's the point of this? By the time you get it, you're already too strong, and then you get a buff on top of that, and a sense of pride and accomplishment maybe? It doesn't really do anything to stop the snowball, especially with the nerf to confederations, making it so instead of one or two big factions at the end, you get a bunch of minor ones that can't really do anything to you. There's also a new endgame event I suppose, but it's really the old chaos mechanic of spawning a bunch of doom stacks for a random faction. Now it's not all bad. There is the outpost system, which is part of the base Warhammer 3 experience, which lets you recruit and control units from other factions, including DLC factions that you might not own, as long as you're allied to them. And with a mod that opened up the recruitment cap a little bit for me, and the variety of factions in Warhammer 2's Immortal Empires mode, it's actually a lot of fun. Not so much for the fact that it lets you recruit other units, which is actually pretty cool, but more so for the fact that it lets you try out units from DLCs that you might not own yet. For me, I hadn't purchased the Vampire Coast because I didn't really think the faction was all that interesting. But after recruiting some of their units in a pinch, I realised that zombie bats with guns are pretty fun, and so I ended up purchasing their DLC. Which is great for Creative Assembly, right? I ended up making a purchase of a DLC that I wouldn't have otherwise, just because I got to try out a few units from a mechanic that they added to the game. So why don't garrisons work like this? For all of my previous complaints about sieges, one thing I didn't mention was that every garrison in the game for every player is the exact same. No DLC units appear in any of them regardless of if you've purchased it or not. Why? I guess Creative Assembly didn't want the hassle of handling different garrisons for players depending on which DLCs they had, so they just gave everyone nothing. Now aside from the fact that as someone who bought the DLCs, that sucks, it makes the sieges worse as well. I mean, now you're stuck playing the same sieges in the same way, with the same units. Imagine giving a Skaven player a chance to use some Rattling Gunners. They would buy that DLC in a heartbeat. Okay, that's maybe not the best example because that's probably one of the few DLCs that you need to buy. But you get my point, it would add a lot of variety to the game and probably increase DLC sales to boot. Speaking of DLC, the new game's factions desperately needed them, with their paper-thin rosters. Take Kislev and the Empire for example. Playing both on launch was a nightmare, right up there with pre-rework Beastmen and launch day Skaven. But the difference was that as the Empire you could at least tech up into different units. Kislev didn't have that luxury, you'd basically be fighting the same battles in the same way 100 turns later. Now unit variety has never really been an issue in the Warhammer games, because the post-launch DLC has generally been solid. Until now. And when that DLC finally did arrive, it didn't really make things better. Champions of Chaos is arguably the most controversial DLC since the original Warriors of Chaos, which is kind of funny now that I think about it, but man, Giving the Warriors of Chaos all the new lords without even the option to toggle them to the monogods really sucks. Ever since the release of that DLC, there hasn't really been a reason to pick the monogods over the Warriors of Chaos. Their playthrough is inferior in basically every way. Since then, it's mostly been radio silence from Creative Assembly, and that's got a lot of people worried of a Three Kingdoms style reboot coming to Warhammer 3. I mean, it's been a year and all that's really been added since then is one DLC and a few balance changes. That's a huge step down from where we left off in Warhammer 2. Don't get me wrong, Immortal Empires is definitely in a better place now than it was at launch, and I think it's a better experience than Mortal Empires was at the end of Warhammer 2. Especially now that some cut content's been added back, alongside the balance changes and some other amazing mods being released. But it's still quite a ways off from what I was expecting and had hoped to see a year out from its launch. So what's next? Well, we know that Chaos Dwarves are coming in a DLC eventually, but after that, who knows? The Siege rework was a total failure and I don't expect it to ever get fixed or changed in a meaningful way. At the very least, I think they'll cut the buildable system and just let you build it once at the start. But I am hoping for some more DLCs to flesh out existing factions and bring some new ones into the map, alongside some kind of extension to the late game and maybe some way for them to build off their endgame crisis event, and obviously some more faction overhauls. As for the Realms of Chaos mode, I think it will probably be abandoned. Now this might have seemed like a negative video, but like I said earlier, the game is actually pretty good now, but it's not the game I was expecting, and it's really nowhere close, given the half a decade wait. This really feels more like Warhammer 2.5. At the very least, the great modding community and eventual DLCs will keep this game alive, and I'm excited to see what mods like the Simply Fun overhaul will look like in a year or two. And hey, maybe Creative Assembly will fix these issues in the next Warhammer game. You know it's coming.